Okay. Now, for the frontal lobe, as you can see, it's been labeled for, you can see FPOT here. I do recommend that abbreviation. The frontal lobe is the largest lobe. Now, it contains the prefrontal cortex, which is a structure at the front of the frontal lobe, and it has important functions such as complex mental processes, planning, problem solving, reasoning is conducted in this prefrontal cortex. The primary motor cortex is also located here, and you need to know about it. It's at the back, at the rear of the frontal lobe, and is responsible for initiating and controlling all voluntary movements. So that's why it's called the motor cortex, okay? Now, Broca's area, again, you'll often get asked questions about this area versus Wernicke's area, which we'll look at next in a little bit. Broca's area is also located in the frontal lobe. It is only located, however, on the left hemisphere of the brain. It helps to coordinate messages to areas such as your tongue, jaw, and mouth so that you can pronounce words and sounds clearly. It is essential for speech. Remember that it's in the left hemisphere. So Broca's area, without it, we could not produce speech that other people could understand. It is involved in the physical production using your structures of the mouth of speech. What it is not involved in is understanding speech and producing speech that makes sense. Okay? It's just that we become physically unable to produce speech, but we can understand it, and we could technically type out what we mean to say, but we can't produce it because our mouth structures aren't working. Instead, Wernicke's area, damage to Wernicke's area would cause these problems, and you will have to, questions often need you to differentiate between the two, Broca's and Wernicke, so this is really important. We'll have a look at it next in a little bit. Okay, our other lobes, the parietal lobe. It's located behind the frontal lobe in the upper half of the brain. It's the one right next to the frontal lobe. It contains the primary somatosensory cortex, which is exactly as it sounds, at the front of the parietal lobe. Let me show you where. Right here, where my mouse is, somewhere here. The front of the parietal lobe, it receives and processes sensory information from the skin and other body parts. Remember, the sensory information that the thalamus sends the cerebral cortex, it's going to go to the parietal lobe, and the parietal lobe will process touch and body position. Okay, body position in space. So it has spatial recognition, body position. It senses that information and processes it. Then the occipital lobe we looked at, it's located at the back of each cerebral hemisphere. It's literally the back of our head on both sides, and it's almost entirely devoted to vision. The way that's easy to remember is occipital kind of sounds like ocular, okay? So ocular means visual. So the primary visual cortex is located in each occipital lobe and is going to receive and process visual information. Really easy to remember. If you connect the major roles with each part of FPOT, it's going to be really easy. That frontal is higher order processes, personality traits, problem solving, and movement because of primary motor cortex. Remembering Broca's area separately as being the one involved in speech production and being able to coordinate messages between parts of the mouth. Parietal lobe as having the somatosensory cortex and being involved in processing of sensory information, especially tactile and with regards to body position. Occipital, occiput, the back of your head. Ocular information, visual cortex, visual information processing and receiving. And then lastly, temporal makes it even easier because guess what it's related to? It's related to hearing. Okay, so it has the primary auditory cortex is within the temporal lobe. Right next to the occipital lobe, which is responsible for vision, we have the temporal lobe, which is responsible for hearing, the auditory cortex. And the Wernicke's area is there. We're just about to have a look at it. So remember this. The left half of each eye sends information to the left occipital lobe, because that's the occipital lobe is where visual info is processed. The right half of each eye will send information to the right occipital lobe. Okay? However, the left half of each eye gets visual info from the right visual field. Remember how we said visual field versus side of vision are opposite? But remember that it's not the opposite when we talk about the occiput. Okay, so this is just something you need to memorize. There are really good diagrams online with the visual field that you can look up that really helps to make sense of it. I know that this is tricky to remember. It's one of those things that you kind of just need to regurgitate. You just need to memorize. And lastly, we're looking at the temporal lobe. It plays an important role in auditory perception and is also heavily involved in memory. So it's not just about processing auditory information, hearing, but also memory. The primary auditory cortex, there's one in each temporal lobe. It receives and processes sounds from both ears. This is the Wernicke's area that I was talking about that you need to be able to differentiate from Broca's, which is in the frontal lobe. Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe. It's right next to Broca's area, actually, in the left hemisphere, because of the way that the frontal is here and the temporal is here. So they actually are quite connected. It's essential for processing speech. Words don't make sense until they have been processed by Wernicke's area. And if we have damage here, we won't be able to understand what people are saying to us, but whatever we also say will also not make much sense. Not because we can't produce the sounds with our mouth, that would be damage to Broca's area, but because we don't have the comprehension anymore. So this is an example of a VCA question that tests that. The old study design actually used to have questions about this stuff you're learning in year 11, but not anymore. Gertrude is able to speak clearly and can put together long sentences. However, when she speaks, the words are mostly meaningless, and she has trouble understanding others. Gertrude's symptoms are consistent with brain damage too. Okay, let's review the options. Broca's area in the frontal lobe, the auditory cortex in the parietal lobe, Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe, and the visual cortex in the occipital lobe. What can you eliminate straight away? Well, obviously the visual cortex, because we don't have an issue with vision. Let's think about option B, the auditory cortex in the parietal lobe. Now, is it saying that she cannot hear anywhere and process that auditory information? It is not saying that anywhere. She just has trouble understanding, right? Now, Broca's area is the issue with her speech production. Saying she can speak clearly and put together long sentences, that means there's no issues with her producing the speech with her mouth. So the damage is 2C, Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe, because she can't understand the words of others and what she says doesn't make sense, but she can produce words.